Imagine, if you will, the sound of a heavy quill scratching against parchment in a room lit only by the flickering glow of a tallow candle. The year is 1680, and the salt-heavy air of Bristol, England, hangs thick over the cobblestones, carrying with it the scent of wet rope, pine tar, and the distant metallic tang of the incoming tide. In this era, the world is a vast and mysterious expanse, a map only partially drawn, where the edges of the known world are defined by the creaking of timber and the snap of canvas sails against a grey Atlantic sky. It is here, amidst the labyrinthine alleys and the bustling wharves of one of the world's greatest ports, that a boy named Edward Teach first opens his eyes to a world defined by the horizon. Bristol, in the late 17th century, is a city that never truly sleeps, its pulse synchronized with the rhythmic ebb and flow of the river Avon. For a young Edward, the sounds of the city are a constant, low-frequency hum. The rhythmic thud of hammers in the shipyards, the melodic chanting of sailors hauling on lines, and the low, rumbling chatter of merchants discussing the price of sugar, tobacco, and spice. He would have walked these streets as a child, his boots clicking on the damp stones, watching the great masts of the merchantmen rise like a forest of leafless trees against the horizon. The ships are more than just vessels. They are messengers from a world he has yet to see, carrying the dust of the Caribbean and the heat of the African coast back to the cold, misty shores of England. The docks are a sensory kaleidoscope, a place where the familiar smells of home mingle with the exotic aromas of distant lands. One might catch the sweet, cloying scent of molasses spilling from a barrel, followed by the sharp, medicinal sting of gunpowder being loaded into a hold. It is a place of transition, a threshold between the safety of the land and the beautiful, terrifying uncertainty of the deep blue water. As he grows, the young Edward likely finds himself drawn to the water's edge, mesmerized by the way the moonlight dances on the surface of the river, turning the dark water into a sheet of hammered silver. He is a child of the maritime world, born into a society where the sea is the primary engine of life, wealth, and legend. As you settle into your blankets and find a comfortable position for your rest, I want to welcome you to this journey through time. Here at the Slumber Archives, we believe that the stories of the past are the perfect companion for a peaceful night, and we share new history narrations just like this one every single day. If you find yourself drifting off or enjoying this quiet exploration of the Golden Age of Piracy, perhaps you might consider subscribing so you can join us for every new voyage we take. A simple like on the video also helps other weary travelers find their way to our quiet corner of the world. But for now, let the weight of the day lift from your shoulders as we return to the misty docks of Bristol. The records of Edward Teach's early years are sparse, hidden away in the shadows of history like a ship lost in a fogbank. We know him by many names: Edward Thatch, Edward Drummond, or eventually the terrifying moniker of Blackbeard. But in these early years, he is simply a young man looking for his place in a world that is rapidly expanding. It is said he was born into a family of some respectability, perhaps even one with enough means to provide him with an education. For later in life, he would demonstrate a level of literacy and tactical intelligence that set him apart from the common sailor. Yet, the call of the ocean is a powerful siren, and the life of a clerk or a merchant in a landlocked office could never compete with the promise of the wind in the rigging. As the 17th century draws to a close and the 18th century begins, the political landscape of Europe shifts like sand under a receding wave. In 1702, the War of the Spanish Succession breaks out, a conflict known in the American colonies as Queen Anne's War. For a young man with a thirst for adventure and a sturdy pair of sea legs, this war provides the ultimate opportunity. Edward Teach leaves the familiar comforts of Bristol behind and enters the service of the British Crown as a privateer. To understand the man Teach would become, one must understand the life of a privateer, a role that sits on the razor's edge between a legitimate soldier and a common thief. A privateer is granted a letter of marque, a legal document that allows them to attack and plunder the ships of enemy nations in the name of the Queen. It is a life of sanctioned violence, where the rewards are high and the risks are even higher. On board these privateering vessels, Teach learns the intricate language of the sea. He learns how to read the clouds for signs of a coming gale, how to navigate by the steady cold light of the North Star, and how to handle a cutlass and a flintlock pistol with a calm, practiced hand. The atmosphere aboard a privateer is one of tense, quiet anticipation. Imagine the sound of the hull creaking as it cuts through the swells, a rhythmic groaning of wood that becomes a sort of lullaby to the men sleeping in their hammocks below deck. The air is thick with the smell of salt and old timber, and the only light comes from the bioluminescence of the waves breaking against the bow, glowing with a ghostly green fire. It is in this environment that Teach begins to forge his reputation. He is described as a man of unusual height and immense strength, a figure who commands attention not through shouting, but through a quiet, brooding presence that suggests a hidden well of intensity. During the long years of Queen Anne's War, Teach sails primarily out of Jamaica, a lush emerald jewel of an island that serves as the hub for British operations in the Caribbean. Here, the air is vastly different from the damp chill of Bristol. It is warm and heavy, smelling of hibiscus, damp earth, and wood smoke. The Caribbean Sea is a vibrant, translucent turquoise, so clear that one can see the shadows of sharks gliding over the white sands far below. For a man used to the grey waters of the English Channel, this must have felt like a different world entirely, a paradise that was simultaneously beautiful and deadly. As a privateer, Teach is part of a crew that hunts French and Spanish galleons, ships that are often laden with the riches of the New World. He learns the art of the chase, the way a ship must be positioned to catch the wind just right, the patience required to shadow a target for days, and the sudden explosive chaos of the boarding action. He sees the glitter of gold doubloons and the luster of silver bars, and he begins to realize that the wealth of empires is often held by those with the strongest will and the sharpest steel. But wars, like all storms, eventually blow themselves out. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht is signed, bringing an end to the hostilities. Suddenly thousands of privateers, men like Edward Teach, who have spent a decade learning only the trade of maritime warfare, find themselves without a job and without a purpose. The letters of marque are revoked. The legal right to plunder vanishes overnight. The sailors are expected to return to the meagre wages and harsh discipline of the merchant navy, or to find work on the docks they once left behind. For many, this transition is impossible. They have tasted the freedom of the open sea and the thrill of the hunt. They have lived by a different set of rules, where a man's worth is measured by his skill and his courage, rather than his birthright. As the peace settles over the Atlantic, a quiet restlessness begins to stir in the taverns of Port Royal and Nassau. The sailors gather in the dim light, their faces weathered by the sun and scarred by battle, and they speak in low tones about the unfairness of the world. They talk of the governors who grew rich off their labour, and the kings who now cast them aside. And so, as the years pass, and the memory of the war begins to fade, a new shadow begins to stretch across the Caribbean. Edward Teach, now a seasoned mariner in his early 30s, finds himself at a crossroads. Behind him lies the life of a loyal subject, a life of poverty and anonymity. Ahead of him lies the vast, shimmering expanse of the ocean, a place where no king's law can reach, and where a man might carve out a kingdom of his own. He is no longer just a boy from Bristol watching the ships go by. He is a man who understands the power of fear and the importance of image. He he begins to see that in this lawless new world, a reputation can be more effective than a broadside of cannon fire. The transformation is slow, like the gathering of a summer storm on the horizon, a gradual darkening of the spirit, a steady hardening of the heart. The name Edward Teach is about to be whispered with a new kind of reverence and a new kind of terror as he prepares to step out of the shadows of the privateer and into the flickering firelight of legend. The scent of salt-crusted timber and overripe fruit hangs heavy in the humid air of the Bahamas, where the turquoise waters of the Atlantic meet the shallow, sandy banks of New Providence. It is the year 1716, and the harbour of Nassau has become a sanctuary for those who have nowhere else to go, a place where the rules of kings and governors are drowned out by the rhythmic lapping of the tide against the hulls of 100 stolen vessels. Edward Teach walks these sun-drenched docks, a man of imposing height and quiet observation, blending into the colourful chaos of a town built on the spoils of the sea. There is a specific kind of freedom here, one that smells of unrefined sugar, cheap rum, and the iron tang of wet sand. In this lawless paradise, power is not granted by birthright, but earned through experience and a steady hand on the tiller. It is here that Teach finds his mentor in the form of Benjamin Hornigold, a man whose name carries weight across the West Indies. Hornigold is no mere common thief. He is a seasoned captain, a veteran of the privateering wars who has transitioned into the life of a pirate with a lingering sense of old-world discipline. He commands a crew of hundreds and operates with a tactical brilliance that many younger men lack. When Teach joins Hornigold's crew, he does not enter as a simple labourer, but as an apprentice to the dark arts of maritime predation. He watches the way Hornigold reads the wind, the way he positions his sloop to catch the morning light so that his prey is blinded by the glare, and the way he maintains order among a crew of desperate, volatile men. As the months drift by like the slow-moving clouds above the Caribbean, Teach begins to master the intricate geography of these waters. He learns the hidden coves of the exumas, where a ship can vanish behind a curtain of mangroves to wait for a passing merchantman. He memorizes the treacherous shallows and the shifting sandbars that can tear the bottom out of a heavy British frigate, while a shallow draft pirate sloop glides safely over them. This is a landscape of shadows and light, of deep blue trenches and pale green flats, and Teach learns to navigate it with the instinct of a predator. He understands that the sea is not just a highway, but a labyrinth, a place where knowledge of a single hidden channel can mean the difference between a fortune in gold and a shallow grave on a deserted quay. Under Hornigold's tutelage, Teach refines the art of the hunt. It is a patient game, one that requires hours of stillness, followed by a sudden violent burst of energy. They spend their days patrolling the trade routes, their eyes fixed on the horizon for the telltale smudge of a sail. When a target is spotted, the atmosphere on the ship shifts, the idle chatter of the crew dies down, replaced by the rhythmic creak of ropes being tightened, and the soft thud of bare feet on the deck. Teach observes that Hornigold rarely relies on brute force alone. Instead, he uses the threat of violence as a tool, a psychological weapon that often causes a merchant captain to strike his colours before a single shot is fired. This lesson takes root in Teach's mind, a seed that will eventually grow into the terrifying persona of Blackbeard. He realizes that if you can convince a man he is already defeated, the battle is won without the risk of damaging the precious cargo you intend to steal. The partnership between the seasoned veteran and the rising star grows stronger as they navigate the complexities of pirate politics in Nassau. Hornigold eventually grants Teach command of a small sloop of his own, allowing the younger man to test his wings while still remaining under the umbrella of the larger flotilla. It is a period of steady growth, a quiet apprenticeship where Teach learns the logistical burdens of command, the need to keep the water casks full, the sails mended, and the crew fed and reasonably satisfied. He is no longer just a sailor. He is becoming a leader, a man who understands that a captain's authority is a fragile thing, held together by a mixture of respect, fear, and the promise of profit. The turning point for Edward Teach comes in late 1717, near the island of St. Vincent. The air is thick and still as a massive French vessel appears on the horizon, its white sails billowing like heavy curtains against the deep blue of the sky. This is La Concorde, a formidable slave ship of nearly 300 tons, armed with dozens of cannons and carrying a valuable cargo of gold, silver, and human suffering. For Hornigold and Teach, this is the ultimate prize, a ship capable of dominating the Caribbean if placed in the right hands. They begin the pursuit, their smaller, faster sloops darting through the waves like wolves circling a weary stag. The chase is long and arduous, a silent test of endurance and nerves played out over the vast, shimmering expanse of the open sea. When they finally close the distance, the sheer scale of La Concorde is breathtaking. It towers over the pirate sloops, a wooden fortress of French engineering. But the crew of the merchantman is weary, ravaged by disease and the long journey from the African coast. After a brief and lopsided skirmish, the French captain realizes the futility of resistance and surrenders his vessel. As Teach steps onto the deck of the captured ship, he feels the weight of the moment. The creaking of the massive masts and the smell of the French oak under his boots signal a change in his destiny. This is no longer a mere prize to be sold or stripped. This is a flagship. With Hornigold's blessing, Teach takes command of the great ship, and his first act is one of transformation. He begins to refit the vessel, adding more gun ports until she bristles with 40 cannons, turning a merchant ship into a floating fortress of unprecedented power. He renames her the Queen Anne's Revenge, a name that carries a sharp political edge, perhaps reflecting his own lingering loyalties or a calculated jab at the British Crown. As the heavy hammers fall and the new cannons are hoisted into place, the man once known simply as Edward Teach begins to fade into the background. In his place, a new figure is emerging from the smoke and the sea spray, a figure whose very silhouette will soon strike fear into the hearts of the bravest mariners. The apprenticeship is over. The geography of the islands has been mastered. The tactics of the hunt have been refined, and the perfect instrument of terror has been acquired. As the Queen Anne's Revenge catches the wind for the first time under Teach's command, the water parting before its massive bow, the horizon seems to stretch out infinitely before him. The calm waters of the Bahamas are now a staging ground for a reign of piracy that the world will never forget. Teach stands on the quarterdeck, the wind tugging at his coat, looking out over a Caribbean that is about to become his kingdom. The transition is complete, and as the sun dips below the waves, casting long, bruised shadows over the deck, the legend truly begins to take shape in the deepening twilight. The sound of a heavy mallet striking wood echoes across the secluded coves of the Grenadines, a rhythmic, steady thrumming that marks the transformation of a merchant vessel into an engine of war. This captured French slaver, once known as the Concorde, sits low in the shallow turquoise waters as Teach's men swarm over her hull like ants upon a fallen fruit. To the casual observer, she is merely a ship undergoing repairs, but to those who understand the mathematics of maritime power, she is being reborn. The men are widening the gun ports, sawing through thick oak to make room for the iron weight of 40 cannons. This is no longer a ship designed for the efficient transport of cargo. She is being sculpted into a floating fortress, a flagship that will command the respect and the terror of any captain who catches a glimpse of her silhouette against the morning mist. As the refitting continues, Teach walks the length of the deck, his boots clicking softly against the fresh shavings of wood. He is not merely building a ship, he is crafting a symbol. He chooses a name that carries with it a weight of political defiance and personal history, Queen Anne's Revenge. The name is a masterstroke of psychological branding, a nod to the late monarch under whose flag he once fought as a privateer, and a sharp, bitter reminder of the perceived betrayal by the British Crown following the Treaty of Utrecht. By invoking the name of the Queen, Teach anchors his piracy in a sense of misplaced justice, suggesting that his actions are a form of retribution for a world that discarded its sailors once the wars were won. It is a name that sounds elegant and noble, yet it carries the sharp edge of a blade, a promise of vengeance that ripples through the rigging and settles in the hearts of his crew. The men who serve under him are as diverse as the ports of the Atlantic, a tapestry of humanity woven from the fringes of society. There are displaced sailors from the Royal Navy, seeking the freedom and the shared profits that the king never offered. There are formerly enslaved men who found in Teach a captain who valued their strength and their survival more than the colour of their skin. In the world of Queen Anne's Revenge, the rigid hierarchies of the land begin to dissolve, replaced by a rough, democratic meritocracy where every man has a vote and a share of the spoils. They are a loyal, hardened group, bound together by the knowledge that they have stepped outside the law and into a life where their only protection is the strength of their ship and the cunning of their commander. With the flagship ready, Teach begins a series of solo raids that serve as both a training ground for his crew and a warning to the merchant houses of the West Indies. He moves with a predatory grace, stalking the shipping lanes between the Caribbean and the American colonies. He does not always need to fire his cannons. Often the mere sight of the 40 guns peering through the ports of the massive black-hulled ship is enough to bring a merchant captain to his knees. The prizes are rich: barrels of sugar, crates of indigo, bolts of fine silk, and the heavy gold coins of the Spanish Main. As the holds of the Queen Anne's Revenge fill with the wealth of empires, the legend of the captain begins to grow, whispered in the smoky taverns of Nassau and the counting houses of Charleston. It is during these early months of independent command that Edward Teach begins to cultivate the visual persona that will forever define him in the annals of history. He understands, perhaps better than any man of his era, that the battle is often won before the first shot is fired. He begins to grow his beard out, allowing it to become a thick obsidian mass that covers most of his face, reaching down toward his chest. He twists the hair into small braids, tying them with colourful ribbons that flutter in the salt breeze, a strange, jarring contrast to the grim reality of his profession. He wears a heavy silk sling across his shoulders, carrying no fewer than 6 primed and loaded pistols, a bristling display of immediate and lethal force. But the most chilling element of his transformation is saved for the heat of battle. As the Queen Anne's Revenge draws alongside a target, Teach tucks slow-burning hempen fuses beneath the brim of his hat. These fuses, typically used to ignite cannons, smoulder with a low, orange glow, casting coils of thick, acrid smoke around his head. To the terrified sailors on an opposing deck, he does not look like a man at all. He looks like a demon rising from the very pits of the earth, wreathed in sulphur and shadow. The smoke veils his features, leaving only his dark, piercing eyes visible through the haze. It is a calculated piece of theatre, a terrifying mask designed to paralyze his enemies with a primal, superstitious fear. He is no longer Edward Teach, the privateer from Bristol. He has become Blackbeard, a figure of nightmare and myth, moving through the smoke with the calm, terrifying certainty of a predator. The air around the ship seems to grow heavy with the scent of salt and gunpowder, a lingering perfume of the life they have chosen. As the sun begins its slow, golden descent toward the horizon, the Queen Anne's Revenge glides through the water with a quiet, predatory elegance. The creak of the timber and the snap of the canvas are the only sounds in the vast, open silence of the sea. Teach stands at the stern, the smoke from his fuses long extinguished, replaced by the cool evening air. He looks out over the wake of his ship, a white scar on the dark blue water, and he knows that the world is beginning to watch. Every ship he takes, every merchant he spares, and every story that filters back to the mainland adds another layer to the armor of his reputation. He is building more than a fortune. He is building a kingdom of the waves, a place where the rules of the old world do not apply. The diversity of his crew is his greatest strength, a collective of souls who have found a home in the displacement of the ocean. They speak a dozen languages, but they all understand the language of the sea, the way the wind shifts before a storm, the way the light changes when land is near, and the way the Queen Anne's Revenge responds to the slightest touch of the helm. They are the heartbeat of the ship, the muscle that moves the great wooden beast across the world. As the stars begin to emerge one by one, puncturing the velvet ceiling of the night, the ship feels like a world unto itself. The lanterns are dimmed, and the men speak in low, hushed tones, their stories mingling with the gentle lap of the waves against the hull. In the captain's cabin, Teach pores over charts by the flickering light of a single candle. He traces the coastlines with a weathered finger, plotting a course that will take them further north, toward the wealthy ports of the Carolinas. He is not content with the small prizes of the Caribbean. He seeks a grander stage for his theatre of terror. The legend is no longer a whisper. It is a roar that precedes him wherever he goes. The name Blackbeard has become a shorthand for the untamed power of the ocean, a reminder that there are places where the reach of the king is short and the law of the sword is long. And as the Queen Anne's Revenge cuts through the dark water, her 40 guns silent but ready, the man at her helm remains a mystery, even to those who serve him. He is a philosopher of fear, a master of the horizon, and a captain who has traded his soul for the freedom of the salt spray and the infinite, starlit sky. Imagine, if you will, the scent of sulphur and hemp drifting across a quiet deck just before the dawn breaks. To most sailors of the 1800s, these were the scents of industry, or perhaps a flickering lantern, but when they rose from the thick braided beard of Edward Teach, they were the heralds of a living nightmare. He understood, perhaps better than any man of his era, that the battle is often won before the first iron ball is fired from a cannon. He did not wish to sink ships. A sunken ship is a treasure lost to the crushing depths of the abyss. Instead, he wished to capture the imagination, to paralyze the will of his enemies through a carefully choreographed display of demonic power. As a merchant vessel slowed in the doldrums or found itself cornered in a shallow bay, the crew would look across the water to see a figure that defied the natural order. Teach would weave lengths of slow-burning hemp cord, the kind used to ignite the touch-holes of great guns, into his charcoal-black hair and the dense thicket of his beard. When lit, these fuses did not explode. They smouldered with a steady, low glow, wreathed in a thick, acrid veil of white smoke that curled around his face like ghostly fingers. To a superstitious sailor, weary from months at sea and half-starved on hardtack, this was not merely a man standing on the quarterdeck. It was a spectre rising from the sulphurous pits of the earth, a creature who breathed smoke and carried the very fire of the underworld in his hair. This was the core of his philosophy: intimidation over violence. By presenting himself as an unstoppable force of nature, he ensured that most of his prizes surrendered without a single drop of blood being spilled. The psychological weight of his presence acted as a heavy velvet curtain, muffling the courage of those who might have otherwise fought to the death. He was a master of the theatre, a man who wore 3 brace of pistols strapped across his chest like a sash of cold steel, ensuring that every glance toward him met the muzzle of a weapon. And yet, beneath the smoke and the shadows, there was a calculated restraint. He knew that a reputation for mercy toward those who surrendered was just as valuable as a reputation for cruelty toward those who resisted. Life aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge, however, was governed by a logic far more rigid than the chaos of his appearance might suggest. While the world viewed the pirate ship as a floating den of anarchy, the reality was a quiet, rhythmic adherence to the pirate code. This was a social contract written in ink and sweat, a set of articles that every man aboard had to sign or mark with an X before they were allowed to sail. In the stillness of the mid-watch, one might hear the muffled sound of dice being stowed away, for gambling was often forbidden to prevent the simmering of tempers. The distribution of spoils was handled with a mathematical precision that would have put a London bank to shame, with the captain and the quartermaster receiving only a slightly larger share than the common sailor, a radical notion of equality in a century defined by rigid hierarchies. Teach enforced these rules with a firm, measured hand, understanding that a crew of hundreds of men, confined to a wooden hull for months on end, required the steadying influence of order to prevent the ship from consuming itself. There were rules for the cleaning of muskets, rules for the extinguishing of candles at 8 o'clock, and strict prohibitions against bringing unauthorized passengers aboard. It was a strange, paradoxical society, a floating republic of outlaws who lived by a stricter moral compass than many of the landsmen they left behind. They found a sense of belonging in the shared risk of the gallows, a brotherhood forged in the salt air and the rhythmic creaking of the masts. High above this disciplined community, snapping in the Atlantic breeze, flew the banner that has since become the very emblem of maritime dread. The flag of Blackbeard was not the simple skull and crossbones we often imagine today, but a more complex and chilling allegory. Against a field of deepest black, a white skeleton stood, holding an hourglass in one hand to signify that time was running out for those who gazed upon it. In the other hand, the skeleton held a spear, its tip pointed toward a crimson heart that dripped 3 droplets of blood. It was a visual clock, a silent ticking of the seconds that reminded every merchant captain that his life was a finite thing, and that the man beneath the flag held the key to its end. The flag served as a silent envoy, a piece of silk that spoke across the waves when voices could not be heard. It told a story of inevitability, whispering that the pursuit of wealth and the safety of the crown were nothing in the face of the skeleton and the spear. As the ship cut through the waves, the flag would ripple and snap, the white figures dancing against the dark fabric like shadows on a wall. It was a masterpiece of branding, long before the word existed, ensuring that the mere sight of a black speck on the horizon could cause a crew to drop their tools and pray for a favorable wind. And yet, in the quiet moments when the smoke from his beard had faded and the guns were secured, one wonders what Teach thought as he looked out over the vast, uncaring expanse of the sea. Did he see himself as the monster he portrayed, or did he see the smoke as a mask that allowed him to protect his men from unnecessary harm? The psychology of terror is a heavy burden to carry, requiring a constant performance, a never-ending vigil to ensure the mask never slips. He was a man who had turned his very identity into a weapon, a strategist who used the darkness of the human imagination to navigate the sunlit waters of the Caribbean. The ship would move through the night like a ghost, the only sounds being the rhythmic slap of water against the hull and the occasional cry of a seabird. Inside the captain's cabin, perhaps Teach sat by a single candle, the scent of sulphur replaced by the smell of old parchment and salt. He was a man of the world, literate and observant, watching the shifting political tides of the colonies as closely as he watched the tides of the ocean. He knew that the age of the pirate was a fleeting thing, a narrow window of time between the wars of empires, and that eventually the world would grow too small for men who lived outside the law. But for now the horizon remained wide, the fuses were dry and ready, and the legend of the man with the burning beard continued to grow, fueled by the whispers of those who had seen the smoke and lived to tell the tale. As we drift further into the history of this enigmatic figure, the line between the man and the myth continues to blur,
much like the horizon on a misty morning. We see a leader who understood the power of the visual, a commander who ruled through a mixture of democratic consensus and theatrical dread. He was the architect of his own infamy, building a monument of fear that would outlast his own life by centuries. The Queen Anne's Revenge carries us forward, her sails full of a warm tropical breeze, moving toward the shallow waters and the hidden inlets where the next chapter of this story awaits, tucked away in the shadows of the Carolina coast.
The smell of salt air thickens as the Queen Anne's Revenge slows her pace, the heavy canvas of her sails snapping softly in a humid southern breeze. It is the late spring of 1718, and the colonial port of Charleston, South Carolina, is beginning to stir with the morning light. The town is a collection of brick and timber, a bustling hub of trade where the wealthy elite and the hard-working merchant class believe themselves safe within the embrace of the harbour. But as the morning mist clears, a sight greets the townspeople that freezes the blood in their veins. Not one, but 4 pirate vessels have dropped anchor across the narrow mouth of the harbour, creating a wooden wall between the city and the open sea. At the centre of this flotilla sits the massive 40-gun flagship of Edward Teach, her black hull cutting a silent predatory silhouette against the horizon. This was no random act of pillage or a quick raid for supplies. This was a siege, a deliberate and calculated blockade of one of the most important ports in the American colonies. For nearly a week, Blackbeard held the city of Charleston hostage, effectively paralyzing its economy and its spirit. He did not fire a single broadside into the town, nor did he send his men ashore to burn the buildings. Instead, he simply waited. He sat at the mouth of the harbour like a spider in a web, capturing every vessel that attempted to enter or leave the port. Within the first few days, he had seized nearly 10 ships, including the Crowley, a vessel bound for London carrying a group of the city's most prominent citizens. Among the prisoners were several high-ranking officials and a young boy, the son of a wealthy merchant, all of whom were now held under the watchful eyes of Teach's hardened crew. The atmosphere in Charleston was one of frantic, hushed desperation. The governor and the council met in hurried sessions, their voices low as they contemplated the impossible situation. They were defenseless against such a concentrated force, but as the days drifted by, the true nature of Blackbeard's demand began to circulate through the streets, and it was perhaps the most surprising detail of his entire career. He did not ask for a mountain of Spanish gold, nor did he demand silver plate or rare jewels. His price for the lives of the hostages and the lifting of the blockade was a simple chest of medicines. To a modern ear, this might seem like a small request, but in the early 18th century, medicine was a precious and rare commodity, especially in the colonies. Life aboard a pirate ship was a grueling existence, filled with the constant threat of tropical diseases, infected wounds, and the lingering effects of scurvy. Teach's crew was suffering. Without the proper supplies, his small empire of the waves would crumble from within, defeated not by the British Navy, but by fever and infection. And so, he sent a small delegation of pirates into the town to deliver his ultimatum. If the chest of medicines was not delivered within 2 days, he would behead every hostage, burn the captured ships, and reduce the city of Charleston to ashes. The days that followed were thick, with a heavy, agonizing tension. The pirate messengers, led by a man named Marks, were delayed when their boat capsized, forcing them to walk several miles through the marshes. Back on the Queen Anne's Revenge, Teach grew restless. He paced the deck, his long black beard braided with ribbons, his eyes scanning the shoreline for any sign of his men. To the hostages, every hour felt like a lifetime. They watched the sun rise and set over the calm waters of the bay, wondering if the next dawn would be their last. The city itself was in a state of near collapse. Trade had stopped entirely, and the sight of the pirate fleet looming in the distance served as a constant, haunting reminder of their vulnerability. When the deadline passed without word from the messengers, Teach moved his ships closer to the town, a silent, menacing gesture that sent the citizens into a fresh panic. He was a master of psychological warfare, knowing exactly how to tighten the noose of fear without ever firing a shot. Finally, just as the pirates prepared to carry out their grim threats, the messengers returned. They were accompanied by a large chest filled with the requested supplies, mercury, ointments, and various powders intended to treat the ailments of the crew. The governor had relented, choosing the safety of his people over the pride of the colony. Blackbeard was a man of his word, in his own dark way. Once the chest was safely aboard his flagship and the medicines were inspected, he released the hostages. They were sent back to the city, shaken and stripped of their fine clothing, but alive. He even returned the captured ships, though not before his men had thoroughly looted them of anything of value. As the pirate fleet weighed anchor and began to sail away from the harbour, a strange silence fell over Charleston. The blockade was over, but the myth of Blackbeard had reached its zenith. He had humbled a major colonial capital, held its leaders in the palm of his hand, and walked away with exactly what he needed, proving that his power was not just in his cannons, but in his ability to command the very air of the coast. This moment marked the peak of Edward Teach's influence. He was no longer just a pirate captain, he was a political force, a figure who could negotiate with governors and dictate the terms of trade. His name was whispered in the taverns of Philadelphia and the drawing rooms of London. He had become a symbol of the untamable frontier, a man who lived outside the laws of kings and nations, carving his own destiny out of the salt and the spray. The Blockade of Charleston was a masterclass in audacity, a daring gamble that solidified his legend for all time. As the Queen Anne's Revenge moved north, leaving the frightened city behind, the water changed from the deep blue of the harbour to the shifting pale greens of the North Carolina coast. The air here is softer, smelling of pine needles and damp earth, where the labyrinthine sounds of the Outer Banks begin to unfold. It is a world of hidden channels, shallow sandbars, and secret coves, a place where a man like Teach could disappear into the shadows of the cypress trees. He was heading toward a temporary peace, a brief moment of quiet in a life defined by storm and fire, but even in the calm, there is a sense of something gathering on the horizon, a realization that the world he had built was becoming too small for the forces that sought to bring him down. The Golden Age was beginning to dim, and the flickering light of his fame was casting longer, darker shadows across the sand. The sound of wood groaning against sand is a heavy, rhythmic noise, a deep vibration that mirrors the settling of a weary heart. It was June of 1718 when the Queen Anne's Revenge, that great and terrible floating fortress, came to a sudden, grinding halt in the shallow waters of Beaufort Inlet. The hull, once so swift across the Atlantic currents, buried itself in the shifting shoals of North Carolina, the masts shivering as the momentum of the great ship died away. Some historians believe this was no accident of navigation, but rather a calculated move by a man who saw the walls of the world closing in. By grounding his flagship and several smaller vessels, Teach effectively downsized his operation, shedding the hundreds of men he could no longer afford to feed and the heavy burdens of a naval commander. He was shedding his skin, leaving the rotting ribs of the Queen Anne's Revenge to be reclaimed by the salt and the tide, while he looked toward the shore with a different kind of hunger, a hunger for the quiet, and perhaps for a clean slate. The air in North Carolina was thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, a sharp contrast to the metallic tang of blood and gunpowder that had followed him for so long. Edward Teach, the man who had woven smoking fuses into his beard to terrify his enemies, now stepped onto dry land with a different purpose. He travelled to the town of Bath, a small and humble settlement that served as the colony's first official port. There, he stood before Governor Charles Eden, a man whose own ambitions were perhaps as vast as the pirates', though hidden behind the lace and velvet of high office, in a moment that must have felt surreal to the locals, watching from the shadows of the wooden storefronts. The most feared man on the high seas knelt and accepted the king's pardon. With a stroke of a pen and a formal oath, the outlaw was transformed into a private citizen. The fires of his reputation were banked, reduced to a low, glowing ember as he sought to integrate himself into the slow-moving life of a colonial gentleman. Life in Bath moved at the pace of the seasons, dictated by the rising of the sun over the Pamlico River and the gentle rustle of the wind through the marsh grass. Teach purchased a home on Plum Point, a quiet stretch of land where the water lapped softly against the banks. He was no longer a ghost of the Caribbean, but a neighbour. He was seen walking the dusty streets, his presence still formidable, yet softened by the absence of his many pistols. It is said he even took a wife, a young woman of about 16 years, the daughter of a local planter, and for a fleeting moment the legend of Blackbeard seemed to dissolve into the mundane comforts of domesticity. One can imagine him sitting on a porch as the evening shadows lengthened, the cricket's song replacing the roar of the cannons, perhaps wondering if a man who had seen the world in flames could ever truly find peace in the stillness of a small town. But the peace of an outlaw is often a fragile thing, a thin veneer of respectability stretched over a foundation of old habits. The transition from pirate to planter was not as seamless as the governor's pardon might suggest. Teach was a man of the sea, and the land, with its fixed boundaries and predictable rhythms, must have felt like a cage. Behind the scenes, away from the prying eyes of the townspeople, a secret and lucrative partnership began to bloom between the reformed pirate and Governor Eden. It was a symbiotic relationship built on mutual benefit, a shared understanding that the laws of the king were often less persuasive than the weight of gold. While Teach was officially a retired mariner, he soon found himself back on the water, though this time he operated under the thin veil of a privateer's license. He began to bring in found ships, claiming he had discovered them abandoned at sea, a legal loophole that allowed him to sell their cargo through the governor's channels. The citizens of Bath watched as wagons laden with sugar, cocoa, and fine silks moved from the docks to the warehouses, and while whispers of his true activities filled the taverns, the official records remained pristine. There was a certain irony in his new life. He was still a predator, but he had learned to hunt within the system rather than outside of it. He spent his days navigating the labyrinthine creeks and inlets of the North Carolina coast, places where the water was tea-colored from the tannins of the trees and the Spanish moss hung like grey shrouds from the cypress limbs. These hidden waterways became his sanctuary and his counting house. He knew every sandbar and every cove, a geography of secrets that kept him one step ahead of those who still viewed him with suspicion. The quiet life was becoming a profitable life, and the legend of Blackbeard was being rewritten in the ledgers of a corrupt colonial government. As the months passed, the line between the citizen and the pirate continued to blur until it was nearly invisible. Teach began to host lavish gatherings at his home, inviting the local elite to share in the spoils of his discoveries. The air would be filled with the sound of laughter and the clinking of glasses. The finest wines from distant lands poured freely for men who had never travelled beyond the borders of the colony. In these moments, Teach was the ultimate host, a man of charisma and wealth who seemed to have conquered the very concept of consequence. Yet even as he smiled and toasted his guests, his eyes must have wandered toward the horizon. The sea was still there, calling to him with its endless possibilities and its lack of pretense. The land demanded a performance, a constant masking of his true nature, while the ocean accepted him for exactly what he was. The partnership with Eden grew bolder, and with it, the resentment of the neighbouring colonies. To the north, in Virginia, Governor Alexander Spotswood watched the situation in North Carolina with growing disdain. To Spotswood, The presence of Edward Teach was a stain on the Crown's authority and a direct threat to the stability of trade. He saw through the thin excuses of found ships and legal pardons, recognizing that the pirate had not changed his heart, only his methods. While Teach felt secure in his sanctuary at Ocracoke Inlet, protected by the shallow waters and the favor of a corrupt governor, a storm was brewing in the north, a storm made of iron and duty. The quiet life in Bath was not a conclusion, but a prelude, a brief and golden autumn before the onset of a harsh and unforgiving winter. The marshes of North Carolina are beautiful in their desolation, a landscape of swaying reeds and salt-stunted trees that seems to hold its breath as the tide moves in and out. It was here, in the labyrinth of the Outer Banks, that Teach spent his final days of supposed retirement. He would anchor his sloop, the Adventure, in the lee of Ocracoke Island, a place that felt more like home than any house on solid ground. From the deck he could watch the birds wheeling in the pale sky and listen to the rhythmic pulse of the Atlantic breaking against the outer shoals. It was a life of suspended animation, a man caught between two worlds. The world of the law-abiding citizen he pretended to be, and the world of the sea king he had once been. The shadows were lengthening now, and the golden hour of his life was beginning to fade into the deep, cool blues of twilight as the forces of the old world prepared to reclaim what he had taken from them. The sharp, metallic scent of brine and gunpowder hung heavy in the damp morning air of November the 22nd, 1718. While Blackbeard found a brief sanctuary in the shallow waters of Ocracoke Inlet, the wheels of colonial justice were turning with a cold, relentless precision in the neighboring colony of Virginia. Governor Alexander Spotswood was a man of rigid principles and a deep-seated disdain for the chaotic freedom of the pirate life. He had watched with growing frustration as the neighboring North Carolina governor, Charles Eden, seemed to turn a blind eye to Teach's presence, and so Spotswood decided to take matters into his own hands, bypassing legal jurisdictions in a focused effort to extinguish the flame of the Blackbeard legend once and for all. He commissioned two small, shallow-draft sloops, the Ranger and the Jane, and placed them under the command of Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy. Maynard was a man of quiet determination, a stark contrast to the flamboyant terror he was sent to hunt. He carried with him the weight of the British Empire and the specialized task of navigating the treacherous, shifting sandbars of the Carolina coast, where larger warships would surely run aground. As the first light of dawn began to bleed across the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of violet and grey, Maynard's vessels crept silently toward the inlet. There was no wind to speak of, only the slow rhythmic creak of the oars as the men pulled through the glassy water. Blackbeard, aboard his ship the Adventure, was not caught entirely unaware. He had spent the previous evening drinking with local traders, and though his crew was small, perhaps only 20 men remained at his side, the old fire still burned within him. He stood upon the deck, watching the two silhouettes emerge from the morning mist, and he knew that the time for hiding had come to an end. The silence of the marsh was suddenly shattered by the roar of the Adventure's cannons. The initial broadside was devastating, tearing through the rigging and the hulls of the approaching sloops, leaving Maynard's men to scramble for cover. In the confusion, the Ranger took heavy damage, and many of Maynard's sailors fell where they stood. But Maynard was a tactician of patience. He ordered his remaining men to retreat into the hold of the Jane, hiding them beneath the deck to create the illusion that the ship was nearly deserted. He wanted to draw the pirates in, to make them believe the victory was already theirs, lure them into a trap born of their own overconfidence. Through the drifting smoke, Blackbeard saw the seemingly empty decks of the Jane and signalled for his men to board. The two vessels drifted together, their timbers groaning as they touched, and with a roar that echoed across the quiet waters of the Sound, the pirates leaped across the gap. Teach was the first among them, a towering figure draped in the smoke of his own pistols, his beard a tangled thicket of shadow. But as his boots hit the deck, the hatches flew open, and Maynard's hidden men surged upward like a sudden tide. The air became a cacophony of steel clashing against steel, the heavy thud of flintlocks, and the desperate shouts of men fighting for their lives in the cramped confines of the deck. It was a brutal, intimate dance of violence. In the centre of the chaos, the two commanders finally found one another. Lieutenant Maynard and Edward Teach stood face to face, the representative of the law and the king of the outlaws. They fired their pistols simultaneously. Maynard's shot found its mark in Teach's body, but the pirate did not fall. He lunged forward with his cutlass, snapping Maynard's sword at the hilt with the sheer force of his blow. The struggle was frantic and breathless. Teach was a man who seemed to defy the very limits of human endurance. Even as Maynard's men closed in, striking at him from all sides, he continued to fight with a wild, primal energy. It is said that he suffered 20 cutlass wounds and 5 pistol shots before the light finally began to dim in his eyes. He was in the act of cocking a fresh pistol when his strength at last failed him, and he slumped to the deck, the life draining out of him into the weathered wood of the Jane. With the fall of their leader, the remaining pirates surrendered, or were pushed into the sea. The sudden silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the lapping of the water against the hulls and the laboured breathing of the survivors. Maynard, looking down at the fallen giant, ordered that Teach's head be removed and suspended from the bowsprit of the vessel as a grim trophy and a warning to all who would follow in his wake. As the Jane began its slow journey back toward Virginia, the headless body of Edward Teach was cast into the dark waters of Ocracoke Inlet. And it was in this moment, as the physical man vanished beneath the waves, that the legend truly began to take root. The sailors who watched him fall began to whisper stories that would grow and shift like the sands of the Outer Banks. They claimed that his headless body swam 3 times around the ship before finally sinking into the depths. They spoke of a ghostly light that would forever haunt the waters of the inlet, a flickering glow known as Teach's light, searching eternally for the head that had been stolen from him. The news of his death spread through the colonies and back to the crowded docks of London with the speed of a gale. To the authorities, it was a victory for commerce and the rule of law, a sign that the Golden Age of Piracy was drawing to a close. But to the common folk, the story of the fight at Ocracoke was something more. It was a tale of a man who had lived outside the boundaries of a rigid world, a man who had become a force of nature. As the sun climbed higher in the sky on that November day, the smoke cleared, and the waters returned to their peaceful, rhythmic pulse. The Ranger and the Jane sailed away, leaving the inlet to the birds and the wind. But the name of Blackbeard did not fade. It lingered in the salt spray and the shadows of the maritime forests. He had become a ghost of the Atlantic, a figure woven into the very fabric of the coast he had once terrorized. The man was gone, buried in the cold embrace of the sea, but the legend of the great pirate was only just beginning to wake, destined to wander through the dreams and nightmares of history for centuries to come. The transition from a living man to a myth is a slow, quiet process, much like the way a ship disappears over the horizon. First the hull, then the masts, until only the memory of its silhouette remains against the sky. Maynard had won the battle, but in the long, drifting reaches of time, it was Teach who would occupy the imagination of the world. The brutal reality of the deck of the Jane was soon replaced by the romanticized imagery of the Sea King, a figure of dark majesty who represented the ultimate rebellion against the constraints of society. Even now, if one stands on the shores of Ocracoke when the moon is thin and the wind is high, it is easy to imagine that the shadows are moving and that the king of the pirates is still there, watching over the hidden channels and the secret places where the land meets the endless, rolling sea. The scent of salt air and decaying wood has a way of preserving secrets long after the men who kept them have turned to dust. For centuries, the name of Edward Teach existed less as a historical record and more as a lingering whisper in the maritime fog, a ghost story told to keep sailors alert and children tucked safely in their beds. Legends began to sprout like wild vines around the inlets of North Carolina, suggesting that perhaps the pirate's physical end was not his final chapter. Local lore speaks of a headless figure seen swimming in the dark waters of Ocracoke Inlet, searching eternally for the head that was severed on the deck of the Jane, while others claim to see a strange, flickering light dancing across the marshes on stormy nights, a lantern carried by a phantom captain who still patrols his favorite haunt. These stories are the gentle ripples left behind by a stone cast into the deep, and they speak to our human need to believe that such a formidable will could never truly be extinguished by something as simple as a sword or a lead ball. And so, the search for Blackbeard's buried treasure became the primary occupation of dreamers and wanderers for nearly 300 years, while historical evidence suggests that Teach likely spent his spoils as quickly as he earned them, paying for protection and supplies in the colonial towns. The allure of a hidden chest filled with Spanish gold is a powerful lullaby. People have scoured the dunes of the Outer Banks and dug into the muddy banks of the Pamlico River, hoping to find the physical remains of a life lived in defiance of the law. But the real treasure was never gold or silver. It was the story itself, a narrative that grew more ornate and polished with every retelling, until the man was entirely obscured by the myth. The myth remained the only tangible part of his legacy until the late 20th century, when the sea finally decided to give up one of its most significant secrets. In November of the year 1996, a private research firm working off the coast of Beaufort, North Carolina, discovered a cluster of cannons and anchors resting quietly in the silt of the ocean floor. Beneath 20 feet of water, buried under centuries of shifting sand, lay the remains of the Queen Anne's Revenge. It was a discovery that bridged the gap between the tall tales and the cold, hard reality of 18th century piracy. As archaeologists carefully brushed away the sediment, they found thousands of artifacts that painted a picture of daily life aboard the most feared ship in the Atlantic. There were tiny glass beads, pewter plates, and even medical instruments, a reminder that Teach was a man who planned for the survival of his crew, providing them with the tools of science as well as the tools of war. As the years passed, the recovery of these items allowed us to touch the past in a way that the legends never could. They found gold dust in the cracks of the floorboards and lead shot still resting in the barrels of the cannons, frozen in time at the very moment the ship ran aground in June of 1718. It is a quiet, sombre experience to look at a simple clay pipe or a brass buckle recovered from the wreck, knowing that it once belonged to a man who lived a life of such high-stakes drama. These objects serve as a grounding force, pulling the soaring legend of Blackbeard back down to the earth, or rather, back down to the sea floor. They remind us that behind the smoke and the fury, there were men who ate, slept, and felt the spray of the ocean on their faces, far from the comforts of a home they had long ago abandoned. Meanwhile, the cultural image of the pirate continued to evolve, using Edward Teach as its primary blueprint. From the pages of Treasure Island to the flickering screens of modern cinema, the archetype of the pirate captain, the tricorn hat, the long coat, the bristling weaponry, and the fierce, unyielding gaze is almost entirely derived from the persona Teach carefully constructed. He understood the power of branding long before the word existed, realizing that if he appeared as a devil, he would rarely have to act like one. This theatricality has become the standard for how we perceive the Golden Age of Piracy, turning a brutal and desperate way of life into a romanticized adventure. We choose to remember the billowing sails and the freedom of the horizon rather than the scurvy, the dampness, and the constant shadow of the gallows. As we look back through the lens of history, we see that Teach was a master of adaptation. He moved through a world that was rapidly changing, as the wild frontiers of the Americas were being tamed by the rigid structures of the British Empire. He was a man out of time, a figure who chose to live by his own code in an era that was increasingly intolerant of such independence. In the quiet moments of the night, when the world is still and the only sound is the rhythmic breathing of the tide, it is possible to see him not as a monster, but as a person who desired a life without boundaries. He was a product of his environment, a sailor who saw the vastness of the Atlantic and decided that he would rather be its master than its servant. The real Edward Teach remains a figure of shadow, a man whose true motivations and inner thoughts are lost to the depths of time. We do not know what he thought about in the quiet hours before dawn, or if he ever regretted the path that led him to that final, bloody confrontation on the Jane. What remains is the smoke from his fuses, the smoke from his cannons, and the smoke of the legends that continue to drift across the centuries. He is a permanent fixture of our collective imagination, a reminder of a time when the world was still large enough to hold such immense and terrifying figures. As the waves continue to wash over the site where the Queen Anne's Revenge once sailed, and as the sand slowly covers and uncovers the secrets of the Carolina coast, the story of Blackbeard finds its rest. The violence and the noise have faded, replaced by the soft, enduring pulse of the ocean. The king of the pirates has found his peace in the archives and the museums, and in the hearts of those who look out at the dark water and wonder what lies just beyond the reach of the light. The fire in his beard has gone out, the cannons are silent, and the great ship is at home in the deep. In this stillness, the legend and the man finally become one, drifting together into the long blue memory of the sea. The wind carries no more threats, only the gentle sigh of the salt air, a lullaby for the restless soul of the man they called Blackbeard, and for all those who find solace in the stories of the old, wild world. The horizon is dark now, the stars are bright and cold, and the tide is coming in, washing away the footprints of the past and leaving only the smooth, clean sand, waiting for the morning.